Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking with Kate Brandis. Kate has worked as a geologist, environmental scientist, native plant program manager, and professor. She has also written the book, Native Plants for the Small Yard, Easy, Beautiful Home Gardens that Support Local Ecology. Hi, Kate. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Oh, I am really looking forward to this conversation, and I think a lot of other people will really enjoy this too. Let's start off by taking just a couple of minutes to tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what you do, especially in regards to gardening with native plants.
Sure. So I've done a lot of things professionally in my life, but one thing that has always been true since I was young is I've always been really interested in plants. I was someone who, as a 20-year-old, instead of going out somewhere, I was in the woods with my field guide trying to figure out what the plants were. That's what I did for fun. I love that. I still love to particularly in the spring where I live in Pennsylvania, it is a big celebration always to go in the woods and find the spring ephemeral flowers, which is a love of mine. So that's always been a constant in my life. I'm not a biologist. I just am totally self-taught with plants. I've never studied it in school. It's just something that I have always been drawn to. I think mostly because, I'm somebody who I am a geologist, and the things that I teach at Moravian College, and I teach geology. I also teach a class on landscape and culture. And so, when it comes down to it, I'm really interested in the landscape. I'm interested in the landscape, and flowers and plants are such a part of that it's sort of like naturally, it's part of the story, I guess, of the land. And I'm really interested in place and a sense of place. And I think that native plants really define that for me, at least to some degree. Where you are, what's growing there is particular to where you are. And so even though my background can sound very disjointed, I think sort of the landscape and sense of place kind of is what all connects it together.
Yeah. And you mean all 20-year-olds didn't spend their time out in the woods with a field guide?
I know. Super
normal.
Yeah. Nope. I still like to do that.
Yeah, me too. But yeah, and I love that, bringing in the sense of place and all those various aspects that you do bring in there, because I agree. The plants that we see, those native wildflowers, the native trees, the butterflies, the birds, just everything, it really does bring in that sense of place, that community really can play a major part in defining who we are and just bringing comfort sometimes.
Absolutely. I would agree on all counts. That's what it is for me. It does feel like, I live in a small town, but it certainly, my community also includes this natural setting that I'm in. And it is absolutely a comfort to be in your familiar place. It's lovely to travel. It's lovely to go see new things. But I always find it very comforting to come back to my own woods and my own, the things that I'm very familiar with is definitely a comfort. So sure. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you worked for a while at Lehigh Gap Nature Center and was running a program there that was really fascinating and interesting, working with native plants and getting them into the community and getting everybody gardening with them. And that's going to be a lot of what we'll probably draw on today with our conversation, because we'll talk about that more, I'm sure, as we go.
Yeah. They got a grant over 5 years to do a project that involved community and putting native plants in a community setting in the Lehigh Valley, which is a 2-county area in eastern Pennsylvania. That's where I'm located, very close to that. And that's where the project was centered. And when I heard about the project, did not work there, but I was so excited by the idea of that project and what the possibilities could be for that grant money, that I figured out a way to get a job there and to take over that project. So that's how excited I was by that possibility. And it was very fun. And I'm happy to chat with you about any aspect of that.
Awesome. Yeah. And that just shows how passionate you are and knowledgeable as well to be able to do it, because you had to have the passion to go after it and you had to have the knowledge to be able to keep it and do it for 5 years. So I don't care that you don't have a degree in botany or biology. I mean, the passion shows through. There's other ways to learn.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that's one of the most important things for if anyone's listening and thinks that maybe, because I think native plants, sometimes we hear a lot of Latin names and we just, it feels maybe a little bit hard to break in to understand that whole world. But I will say that, I think there is so much of our community that they are expert because they've, train themselves or they have gotten expertise by just doing, right? And I think that that's so important for you don't have to have a degree in order to do these things, or to know a lot, and you don't have to know everything, right? But if you know enough, I think, well, if you know enough, you can certainly do anything you want. And working with people who know more than you or who know other things, it's all good.
Exactly. And I'm the first one to admit I don't know everything.
No,
in fact, the more I learn, the more I know that I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes. But moving back onto the native plants and gardening with native plants topic, I think a lot of times native plants, especially in the garden, sometimes get a bad rap because so often we think of, especially as society, we think of native plant gardens as being these more natural, more free form, almost wilder gardens. Yeah. And I love that personally. But at the same time, I understand that sometimes that can look a little messy to people. And I get it, because even though I prefer that more natural, free form style of gardening, I've got friends who like that more manicured, more well-behaved garden style and look. And neither of those styles are right. Neither of those styles are really wrong. Both have their place, I believe, in our built environment. But at the same time, I also recognize that that more natural free-form style that I really like often doesn't meet HOA guidelines. It doesn't meet city ordinances, or even just those kind of unspoken neighborhood standards that are sometimes in place. So depending on where you're at, those can be pretty big concerns sometimes. So when we talk about incorporating native plants into the yard or gardening with native plants, one of the topics that I see brought up a lot of times, and I've been asked this question, I've seen it on Facebook groups, I've seen it in other discussion sites, wherever, talking about how do you do this in a way that meets those HOA standards, meets those neighborhood guidelines. And because of your work with the Lehigh Gap Nature Center, I'm guessing you've probably dealt with some of this on a personal level and had some of that experiences. So can you share some of that with us? And how would you go about really meeting those? Or I guess a better way to put it would be, can gardening with native plants fit into these standards and guidelines?
Yeah, so my answer might be kind of long about this, but I think that in some ways your question is the question. So I mentioned that I did this project for 5 years for Lehigh Gap Nature Center, and we had funding over all those 5 years. And the funding could just really be to buy plants and put them in. All the money went to plants. And when we got that grant, which was a wonderful gift, the grantor kind of left it open to us. Like all they told us was that we want you to use this money to put native plants in the Lehigh Valley landscape, period. And the way in which we did that was totally up to us. And, I was in charge of the program, but we were working with different partners, like certain people who had expertise in native plants from colleges and universities in our local area. We were working with people who were working in conservation, different conservation organizations in the area. So we had kind of a whole steering committee of people. And we thought, well, we have this really great opportunity with this 5 years of money to really kind of maybe answer a question that hasn't been answered yet. We really wanted to provide something at the end of that 5 years that we felt like wasn't already out there. And what was already out there, as kind of as you're describing, is, if you want to see pictures, if you want to get kind of plans for using native plants, there's a lot of examples for people who have very large properties, who love that wilder look, But, so that's one sort of set of examples and so you need a large property. You have to like that aesthetic and you have to be comfortable presenting that aesthetic in your neighborhood. So that's very few people, honestly. Like for one thing, most people have a small yard.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if you live in a neighborhood, most people, and there are actually social scientists who study how people make decisions in their yard. And we looked at the social science behind this. So I'm a scientist and I, think that data and information is valuable. And we did a lot of research before we decided what to do with that grant money. And one of the things that we researched was how social scientists had looked at how people make decisions about their yard. So there are actually people who go out and study this, right? And so there are actually quite a few studies. And what people find is that, which is maybe not too surprising, is that people make decisions, again, general cross-section of the population, not, generally people make decisions about their yard, not because they want certain wildlife. That's not typically their objective. Their actual objective, particularly when they live in a neighborhood, is that they want to fit in. They don't want to be odd or different. They want to do what everybody else is doing, right? And so, I think we wanted to recognize that right up front in our project and accept that that was true. And that what we wanted to do was meet people where they were and kind of have that as our starting point. So, one example is sort of people with big properties. The other example I think that people see in society when they're looking for examples of native plants are, they might go to a nice botanical garden. We have so many here in my part of Pennsylvania. There are, a lot of the really famous botanical gardens are right around here in New York City, which is only an hour away. Philadelphia is just an hour south of me too. So lots of examples. And there are native plants there and they're beautifully done with the team of 20 or 30 gardeners. So, this is another kind of way in which people have been experiencing plants out there in the world, And so what we thought, when we were first starting that project was that what the need was then, if we wanted to make change on a neighborhood scale, which is we did want to do that, because our place was focused in this 2-county area in Pennsylvania, was that we needed to give resources to residents to be able to practically use native plants in their yards in a way that felt comfortable in a neighborhood. So we were not ever dealing with neighborhood kind of regulations about this or that. But what we did do is we thought over those 5 years very carefully about how we were going to design gardens that would fit in with other gardens in the neighborhood, like native gardens that looked like other gardens. We were never creating topiary, plethras or any, we were never going super formal. It was always a more casual style, but they were gardens that were designed and were intentional and were very thoughtful in terms of, bloom times and design a little bit. I'm not a designer, again, no training whatsoever in design, but I did design all the gardens. And sometimes that was, with input from whoever we were working with. But I think that really mattered and it helped. So at the end of the day, what I'm saying is that I think that people can absolutely use them in their yard and people do have different aesthetics. Some people have a big property and can use that big, meadow, wild look. And I love that too, but a lot of people don't, or they don't have the space for it. And so, I think having resources out there and examples that you can draw on that are of a different kind of native plant garden, one that is a little more designed, a little bit more of the kind that you are used to seeing in people's yards, then that can work in a lot of applications that you're talking about, I think.
Yeah, and I completely agree with everything. And I really like the fact that you brought in those social scientists to look at the social science data, because I think that's something that so often gets forgotten and left out. And it is so important because, like you said, we all want to fit in. I know with me, yes, I was the 20-year-old, I was the high school kid that was running around with the field guide in the woods. And that doesn't exactly fit in a lot of times. I know we were joking, doesn't everybody do it? But no, they don't. And it can be isolating, especially to a high school student. But even as adults, we want to think that, yeah, we're beyond all that, but no, we still want to fit in and we want people to meet us where we're at. And so, yeah, I think all those things that you were bringing in are so important. And the fact that you have this guide now and this book that provides those guidelines and those designs that people can use in their own yard. So it's not even like, yeah, it can be done, but go figure it out yourself. I mean, you've got the blueprints if people want to look, and then they can choose and pick and play as they want to and modify as needed. I mean, I think that's very important. And then that whole idea of basically, if I'm hearing you right and looking at the book, there are plenty of native plants out there that we can use just like you would any other ornamental plant. And it's just choosing what plant you're putting in there, whether it's an exotic or a native, and picking the right plant for the right place, which is true of any gardening situation.
Yeah.
No matter where the plant originated at. That's really all it is with gardening with native plants as well.
Yeah, no, that's all very true. And, what we envisioned at the beginning was that, okay, at the end of 5 years, what we want to do is we want to develop something super practical for residents. And what, our vision was that we would create a little booklet that would have garden designs and a lot of super practical information that people could create their own gardens in their residential space, and particularly in small spaces, because we felt like, again, there wasn't a lot of resources for that. So our strategy for developing that book, we wanted it to be practical and we wanted it to be based on real garden experience. And so, when we started out the project, that 5-year project, the first 3 years, again, informed by that social science that said to us, people want to just fit in, right? One of the things that we realized was that we needed to get native plants out in sort of public spaces and public gardens to kind of normalize, at least in the Lehigh Valley, normalize that idea of native plants. Maybe people would see this plant that they're not used to seeing, right? Because if you go into, really landscaping in any kind of, strip mall or whatever it is out there, there's really very few plants that people are using in those areas. So what we wanted to do is get some other native plants out there in public spaces so people could kind of start normalizing the look of those gardens. And it also gave us a chance to experiment with different native plants of all kinds to figure out what works in a small space, because all of these gardens that we were putting in public spaces initially, they were all small. What works in a public space, what doesn't, that sort of thing. So our first 3 years of the project, we spent putting in about 40 gardens in public spaces. So they were put in all kinds of places, churches. There was a homeless shelter. We put them in different schools. We put them at a YMCA, just you name it, business parks, community centers. And the way that worked is we would sort of open ourselves up and say, okay, if you want a garden, come see us, public space people. And people would approach us and we would work with them to design a garden in their space. And that community partner would be responsible for maintaining that garden for 5 years. And we had a contract with them initially, that we would sign before we did anything. And then, we would put in the garden, and then I would go back to that garden 3 times a year post installation to see what plants were doing well, what weren't. We also surveyed people at those community areas and the community partners about how people were feeling about that garden, what was working, what wasn't from a community standpoint. And, essentially those gardens, we put in 40, 36 of those were successful. So that was over 90% of those, and again, I was going back 3 times a year post installation. So some of those gardens I tracked for 4 years or more. And, part of our efforts were we would go back, we would see what was working, what wasn't working, and we would make slight adjustments, if need be. And so we were able to sort of successfully introduce these natives to community members. All of the gardens had an informational sign so people could kind of learn some things. But I think maybe most importantly is over, in those 40 gardens, what we learned so much about which native plants work in small spaces and what kind of designs work best. And, and again, I'm not a designer, but, we just use general rules of thumb that, anybody can do.
Right.
And that's what we used. We used all of that information then to develop this booklet that eventually was produced for residents. And that book has 9 designs in it, 9 garden designs, and they're all like, we try to think of, okay, well, what are the most common small spaces that any homeowner would have, so there's like a front porch garden, there's a mailbox garden, there's a downspout garden, there's a small water feature garden, corner garden, all of Rockwall garden, all of the ones that, maybe people with small spaces would have. And we wanted to give them options. And each garden plan has different native plants for, different environments. So if you have a wet, sunny area, this array of plants would work in that particular garden setting. And, just to kind of describe what the book looks like a little bit.
Yes. And I mean, it's very well laid out, very easy to read. I mean, I really like it, the way you did it. And the fact that you do have these very small gardens and they're not overwhelmed with plants, and it's very simple and easy to follow. And like you said, you've got ones that kind of meet what most people would have. So yeah, I mean, I like that fact. And it is a very nice, practical, hands-on piece for people that have those smaller areas and want that more traditional look, because the landscape designs that you set out are very traditional. In appearance, it's just that you've substituted native plants for some of the non-natives that you might see in there.
Exactly.
So what are some of your tips for people that are listening to this and might be thinking, okay, I've got a small garden. This sounds like I might be able to do it. And I don't want it to look wild and crazy. And it doesn't sound like yours looks wild and crazy. So they might be thinking to themselves, yeah, where do I start? How do I get started? What are some of these tips for getting started and for picking your native plants?
Yeah, I mean, I would say my biggest tip, and this is, I think, hard sometimes even for me to follow, but because, I'm somebody, like you might have figured out by now, that's really excited by plants. And so it's hard for me to like go to the nursery and not buy 50 things. But but I think my biggest tip is to just start small, because this is the way I started gardening with native plants. I started with 1 or 2 plants, and you kind of really have to get to know how the plant works in the space that you're putting it in, and does it work in your yard? Like any plant, some people have lots of that particular thing, and then you can't grow it in your yard at all. And maybe that's even in the same neighborhood, so there's just mysteries sometimes about gardens. But, because natives are unique, just like any plant, but it's just, I think, good to start small. It's good to know what it looks like when it comes up and, in the spring, so that when you're trying to weed and things like that, you can kind of recognize it. So to me, that's the superpower of growing natives, is that if you really know the whole cycle of that plant, you're just going to be better off. And that takes time. It takes time to recognize it, and it takes time to figure out, what works and what doesn't. So I would say that's my biggest takeaway, is don't start with too many different kinds at one time. And the second thing I would say is, if you're dealing with a small space, there are natives out there, just like, non-natives, that can be very aggressive. And so, those are ones to avoid, probably. You don't want something that's going to spread and take over and just be a big hassle. So that would be my other big tip, I would say.
Yeah, those would be my top 2, as well as don't bite off too much at one time, either with too many plants or too big of a space, even within a small space. I mean, that's my problems. I'm always tackling too big of a project. I forget to break the big projects down into small bite-sized pieces, because I want it all and I want it now. And of course, I'm going to find 20,000 hours to do it all this year, even though I've never been able to do it before.
Yeah.
And I love your tip of learning the plants from the time they start coming up as seedlings to the time they are large, because that is also so important. I don't know how many times I have pulled my native plants. I mean, even now, and I grow some of them and sell them in a very small scale nursery that I own that grows plants for pollinators and wildlife conservation. I grow them. I know what they come up as seedlings because I sprout them. And yet I'll put them in my garden and do that very early spring weeding, because of course it's pretty. And of course I've got to get out there and do something. And I've pulled so many coreopsis seedlings coming up. I've pulled so many butterfly milkweeds coming up. Yeah. And I know so many other people that have done it too, that also have years of experience, where we get out there and we forget and we're just going and oops.
Oh yeah, it's for sure easy to do. And exactly. We're all so excited to get out in the spring, maybe this spring more than so sure, that's just natural to do. And I think, like if any gardener wants to just like, let's tap down the weeds now, so we don't have to deal with them later. So, the whole pulling out is so natural. But yeah, I'm lucky in that my husband likes to garden as well, and he's really interested in native plants too. So that's helpful because we can both kind of be a set of eyes and, oh, do you remember what this is? And, it's helpful to
Yes.
have somebody else around who knows a little bit.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And then
Mhm.
with your book too was another really good thing that I really enjoyed seeing was that you have container gardens
Mhm.
with native plants.
Mhm.
And I mean, so often, especially when you're coming at it from an ecological perspective and a
Mhm.
biological perspective, we think about the plants growing in the wild or in our gardens, and they put down these long roots and helps to hold the soil and all that good stuff. But then it's like, okay, how does that translate to container gardening?
Mhm.
And sometimes I get that question. In fact, I get that question quite a bit from people who have very small areas. Maybe it's a patio, or maybe they rent a house and their landlords don't want them digging up the yard and putting in flowers, but they want to have flowers. So they can only do container gardens. And having that option, having that ability to look and say, okay, here's some plants that work really well in containers
Mhm.
was very interesting. I think that's going to be valuable to a lot of people as well.
Sure. Yeah, and they absolutely can work. And, again, we wanted to provide resources to people who either had small yards or maybe an apartment or maybe not on a yard at all. And in some of those initial gardens that I was describing that we did in the community, one of the gardens that we partnered with, this was at a homeless shelter where they actually had a very large vegetable garden, but it's in a city environment and so there's no topsoil. So all of their vegetable gardens were in containers, like big containers, but they needed a pollinator avenue. They needed to draw pollinators in. And so that was our contribution to that garden is we put in containers of natives in order to draw in pollinators for their vegetables. And we did that in a number of garden settings where we were trying to, help the vegetable grower by drawing in the pollinators with our native plants. So that was one of the times that we used containers for sure.
Mhm. And when you're looking at these container gardens, how big are you looking at, or what's the minimum that you would say they need to be?
I don't know if I would say there's a minimum. I mean, containers are a bit difficult in that I always think, the bigger the container, the better, because, if you have a small container of any kind, no matter what kind of container it
Mhm.
is, if it's small, you're going to just be having to water constantly. And, when it's in the heat of the summer and they're outside, it's impossible and almost to keep a
Mhm.
container alive if it's small and you have something that, isn't a cactus.
Yes.
So I think the more soil, the better. But then, of course, they get really heavy. So I think you just have to kind of find the happy medium between you can still move it and, they make bottoms with wheels. I think those are super helpful.
Mhm.
But, finding the point at which you can make it as big as possible, but not so big that you can't manage it, because at least in Pennsylvania, we need to bring things in a lot of times. If it's a container, we need to be able to move it inside. So they can only be so big.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And then when you get smaller, not only is it harder to keep them watered, but you can't have as many plants in there. You can't have that diversity.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's for sure true. And yeah, I think there's all kinds of ways to do containers. I love grasses in containers, but people sometimes they like one thing to be tall in the container and another thing to sort of be spilling out. And that's another reason why a bigger container can be nice.
Mhm. Oh, we should probably point out too, in case people haven't caught this yet, the work that you did and the booklet that was produced, and I'll have a link to it in the show notes for anybody that's interested in it. And I do highly recommend people who have small spaces go check out this book and look at it for ideas and information and hints. But when we're talking native plants, for you in the book especially, you're in Pennsylvania. This
Yeah.
project was done in Pennsylvania. So native plants listed in the book may or may not be native to wherever our listeners are at, depending on what part of the country, what state, wherever that they're located in.
Mhm.
I will say I'm in Kentucky. Most of what you had listed in the book are native to here as well. There were a few species in there that I didn't recognize, and I'd have to look them up to see, is it just a species that I'm not familiar with that is native to here, or is it a different species? But even those, looking at them, we have plants that I know are native, species that I know are native here in Kentucky. that are in the same genus. So it would be very easy just to say, okay, I'm not growing pink coreopsis, I'm growing lance leaf coreopsis instead, and just do that quick, easy substitution. So that's something that I would recommend any of our listeners to do if needed. Just kind of check out, see if those plants are familiar, if they're going by the kind of blueprints that you laid out. And then if not, think about what they can substitute in. And native plant societies for your state is going to be the best resource I can think of for kind of coming up with those substitutions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in the book, there is a pretty extensive table in the back that has a whole bunch of different alternative ideas. If you want something different, or you can't get that particular plant, here's another one that will work for those conditions, soil and sun conditions, for instance. And I was thinking about your question about tips, and I thought of another one that I think is useful. And this might sound a little fancy, but it's actually really helpful, I think, is to draw out a garden space. So if you're going to put in a new garden and you're going to use certain plants, you can figure out how big those plants are going to get. And just drawing out using graph paper and kind of scaling out the garden, one little block equals 1 square foot or whatever, something really simple, especially if you're doing something small. And then drawing in those plants to the size that they're going to grow is really, really helpful, because then you're spacing them appropriately. Because a lot of times, when you get plants, they're very teeny, and then you put them all together in a small group because you think, oh, they're so small, you never will. And then, sometime 3 months later, it gets to be full size, and then you realize that you have to move all those things, and that's frustrating. So it can be better to try to draw it out on graph paper. I found that that's super helpful too.
Yes, that's a really good tip. And another one that I use sometimes, because a lot of my land isn't necessarily flat.
Oh, yeah.
And so that can sometimes cause problems with doing it on graph paper, especially when you're looking at sizes.
Yes.
Or I just can't picture it on graph paper sometimes. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. Yeah. I'll go outside and take old garden hoses, or if I don't have enough garden hoses, yarn. I'll just take yarn, and I literally draw it with the garden hoses or with the yarn on the lawn and just draw it all out. And then I can, if I'm trying to figure out the heights of things, I will find things that are that high, or just pile things up that's that high, so that I can get a visual of, okay, yeah, this looks about right. And I can move things around before I actually put the plants in the ground. Because it's a pain to move things after you put them in the ground and then realize, oh yeah, that's too close, or oh my gosh, that's way too tall, it should be that close to the window, or whatever.
Yeah, no, it sure is a pain. I mean, that's a really brilliant idea about the garden hose or yarn. I think that's really smart and a great way to do it too.
So we've kind of touched on this and really kind of naturally gone into it. But let's say somebody has a completely blank slate, normal suburban yard, all grass. And they want to start doing native plants in it. And this is actually a question that somebody wrote me and asked for more information about, was how do I take and convert a normal suburban yard into native plants, following all the guidelines and stuff that I have to do? Which, I mean, we've already touched on a lot of that, which is just traditional landscaping in many ways, but substitute the plants out. And I think your book has a lot of good information as far as designs to give people ways to start that. But are there other tips and things that you would recommend for that person?
Well, I think the only thing I would say that I know we encountered, when we were putting in a lot of gardens during that 5 years, one of the things that we encountered was people had just grass and they wanted to put in a garden, and again, we're talking about very small spaces here. So if it were bigger spaces, I would maybe have a different answer. But, their question was, how do I get rid of the grass, to put this garden in? And so there's different ways to do that. Certainly, you can use mechanical ways, you can use an herbicide, but the way that we used most often, and I think was pretty easy and successful and didn't require any chemicals, but it did require a bit of time, was to just put cardboard down over the grass and weigh it down so that it would stay in place. And so it really took a while then for all of the undergrowth to die off, but then you could plant right into the cardboard. So it might take a good season to kind of let that be there. But then it's really a planting ground that works pretty well, again, for a small space. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was one of the things that we kept encountering. People would have just plain grass, but they'd want to start something small. They didn't know how to get rid of the grass. And that was one method that we used pretty successfully.
Yeah, that's always a big question, is how do I get rid of the grass? And depending on what kind of grass you have, it can be more or less challenging. We'll put it. But yeah, the cardboard route works a lot, especially for small spaces. I've heard people doing plastic, but if you're in the middle of town, that's probably going to be less acceptable than cardboard, and maybe even mulching over the cardboard to kind of make it look like it's a flower bed and waiting.
Yeah. And, if it's a small enough space, really just even shaving off all that turf, that works too. That's very easy, but it's hard work if you're going for any kind of size. So just depends on what the objectives are, I guess, and the resources.
Right. And then making sure the grass is actually dead before you do much planting through it, because that's a weeding chore you don't want to do. In my opinion, having not been patient enough before, even small spaces, that can be pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. I think the biggest struggle that I've seen people have with native plants is, and this would be true with any gardening, I think, is the maintenance weeding piece. And, I think that one way, well, I always like to say to people, gardens require weeding. End of story. If you're going to put in a garden, you need to weed it. That is, always true. But what is also true is I think gardens, if you plant them correctly, and by correctly, I mean, if you kind of layer things a bit so that there's no open ground. Weeds love open ground. They love to have, by open ground, I mean like soil that's getting some sunlight. If you can avoid open soil that's receiving sunlight by making sure you plant your garden, whether it's native or not, in a sort of a layered fashion where, you have sort of like things that are lower and things that are a little taller, so that anyway, the whole bottom area, all the soil is shaded or covered by plants that you want there, reduces the maintenance a lot. So maybe you're going out and pulling some weeds, every month or so rather than every day, or every week even, because that can get pretty old. And it does take a while to establish that sort of more or less maintenance-free garden, but it's worth thinking about it like that. I have a small yard. I have a less than a quarter acre, but we have a lot of natives around here, and we don't mulch. We've just figured out how to plant the garden in this sort of dense enough way that when it grows in, there's really not an exposed soil. And we do weed, but it's not very taxing.
Well, what are some of your favorites for your small garden area? And of course, this is going to vary some for different people depending on where you're at, what your soils are like, what your sun conditions are like. But what are some of your favorite, like lower ones, mid-levels, higher? How do you do that in your own garden?
We've tried to think about a lot of different things, height-wise, but also, we want something blooming all the time. So, some of my favorites are, and I'm just going to be using like the common names, but some of my favorites are false blue indigo, it's a perennial, but it kind of grows almost small shrub-like, and has some beautiful blue flowers. I love anything that kind of stays interesting, and that one stays interesting really all 4 seasons in some ways, because it's got these crazy seed pods that stick up even in the wintertime. And we have a wild geranium, which is a woodland native that kind of grows a lot of different places, and it's quite lovely in the early spring. We have some small clethra bushes, and again, that's a beautiful, beautiful one that attracts butterflies. Phlox, we've got a variety of different native phlox that are great. Some are early spring, some are more midsummer.
Right.
So, we got all kinds of stuff. And, and we planted plenty of things that just don't work. And then we realized we try again. And after a while, if it's not working, it's not working. We give up on that. Try to go with the flow a little bit.
Yeah.
How about you? What are some of your favorites?
Well, for that kind of ground cover type thing, I really love violets.
Oh, violets. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Violets. Great.
Yeah. I'll just let those take over in the garden as kind of a living green mulch.
Absolutely. Exactly.
And I found they'll keep out a lot of things that I don't want
Yeah.
A lot of the weeds, they'll keep them out, but yet the other flowers, the perennials that I want coming back up and stuff, they'll just come right through it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, early in the spring, everything will be purple. And
Hmm.
then the other flowers, the cone flowers, the bee balm,
Hmm.
coreopsis, everything will come up through it.
Hmm.
And then you won't even know later in the summer that I've got violets there because it's so dense that you can't even see them anymore.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That green mulch idea is so important. We have a lot of violets here and love them too. And they're so pretty with their heart-shaped leaves, even, like they're just, I think foliage can be really interesting too in a garden space. Mhm.
Yes, being able to have those, like you said, with the false blue indigo bush, having
Mhm.
something of interest there,
Mhm.
even when it's not blooming.
Yes.
So having those interesting foliage, those interesting seed pods afterwards,
Mhm.
just the interesting growth form. I mean, I love clethra, I love nine bark.
Mhm.
Shrubby
Nice
St.
work.
John's wort
Yeah.
is another one that I really, really like because it has such showy, bright yellow flowers during the middle
Mhm.
of summer. No nectar at all in them. It's all pollen, but still they're absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, Amsonia is another one that I think is super beautiful. Amsonia,
I'm
I
not
don't know.
familiar with that one.
Yeah, there's a couple different types, but we have one out front that has sort of like this very feathery kind of texture. And anyhow, that might not be a Kentucky flower. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not one I'm familiar with. Is it a perennial or is it a
Mhm.
bush or perennial?
It's a perennial. Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I have to look that one up because, yeah, no,
Yeah,
I'm not familiar with that one.
yeah, that's a good one if it grows in your area.
Yeah, and I like a lot of the asters too.
Hmm.
We've
Yeah.
got a lot of native asters here, and
Hmm.
if you time it right with the different species,
Hmm.
and this is hard to do in a smaller area just because it's more plants, so you
Hmm.
might have to pick,
Right.
but you can actually have asters, perennial asters that are native to your area here in Kentucky,
Hmm.
blooming basically sometime late July, August, more August time period, but depending on the year, sometimes starting a little bit in July, but kind of that August all the way up to mid-November, going past some of your first frosts.
Hmm.
And I mean, I just absolutely love those.
Yeah, yeah. Asters are beautiful, and we have a bunch here too, and just lovely. That's a good example of a flower that can be very aggressive.
Yes.
And so, not all asters would be great for a small garden area. But at the same time, at my house here, we have a fence line across one part of it, and we have gardens along that fence, and we mow, around those gardens. So what ends up happening is it's kind of like this island of plants. And that's where we end up putting everything that's kind of on the more aggressive side, and they sort of fight it out with each other. So we have asters there. It's also a more shaded area. Asters love sun, but in a shaded area, they'll become a little more subdued. But they're also planted right alongside with things like mountain mint, which is, if you want pollinators, just such an amazing
I love
pollinator.
mountain mints.
Mountain mint's great. Again, would not put that in a garden in which I would want to,
Mm-mm.
have it be a discrete garden, because mountain mint will take over the entire thing. But planted with asters, where they're kind of duking it out and they're both aggressive, and we have pieweed over there too, which kind of is a bit of a spreader.
Mm-hmm.
But they're actually very harmonious all together. So again, this is like this idea of kind of knowing your plants, and you put something in, you put something else in, and the things that persist with each other, they're creating some kind of balance between them in that particular space. And we couldn't have those plants anywhere else in our property because they would take over. But because they're sort of over there in the shade where they're a little bit more controlled, they get enough sun to grow, but they're also kind of balancing each other out a little bit. Again, this is just stuff you have to kind of learn by trying in your own space and seeing.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, I specifically wasn't bringing up the mountain mints
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because they can be kind of aggressive. And I hesitate to bring up the asters, but like you said, you can put them in
Oh,
slightly less
yeah.
perfect habitat and they'll kind of behave a little bit better. And then, yeah, even with my larger space, my trick for having the aggressive plants, because I love a lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
is to put them all together and say, go at it and let them duke it
Yeah.
out and just know that that's my aggressive bed and they
Mm-hmm.
kind of take care of themselves. Yeah, there's lots of plants I could not put in there. In fact, I have made that mistake and put less aggressive plants in, and yeah, they
Yeah.
didn't last very long.
Yeah, yeah, but I think that's a good strategy. Just put all those bruisers in with each other and see what happens. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So was all of your work with like community gardens or was some of it with individual homeowners?
The way we did it was all of the 40 gardens that I mentioned were in community spaces. But over the course of that 5-year project, we did a whole lot of workshops with people. So typically we would have people come in with graph paper and we would take them through like a really simple design your own space kind of thing and send them home with a gift card to our local native plant nursery where they could kind of get started, and again, these would be small things. So we were working with homeowners and residents in that way. But I think many people got started that way, with those workshops and gift cards. And we also did other community oriented kind of things. Like I did a program in every library in the Lehigh Valley, and there are quite a bit of them. And we bought books through with our grant money. That was one way we used the money, was to buy native plant books for all ages for every public library in the Lehigh Valley, so that we gave them a workshop, but then they would have those resources. Our thought was always like, how can we leave something behind after this grant is over so that people can keep going, that we didn't want the ideas to end with the money ending. And so that was what we did there. We partnered with Pennsylvania Master Gardeners through the Penn State Extension program a lot because, when you're in a neighborhood, the person who can garden in your neighborhood, and that's the person everybody asks questions. And, those are the extension people who are trained, a little bit. Those are the people that we wanted to know about our materials so that they could deliver that message. So we really partnered with them a lot and did a lot of common programming with them. And like I trained a whole group of master gardeners to give the presentation that I give at a workshop just so they could give it, that was the idea.
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, do you still see a lot of native plants in the community and in those community gardens and such that you were talking about making? Did it really persist?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're still there for the most part. Some decisions have changed over, people repurpose certain spaces,
Yeah.
but many of those gardens are still there. The sign is still there and people enjoy those spaces. Yeah, they are still there. And I heard at some point in my life, I heard somebody who does gardens all the time. And really that is her full-time job and always has been. She's like a full-time garden person. And she said to me once that any garden, the life of it is about 5 years, and I don't think that's true for every garden, but that was her practical experience, so I feel like even if those gardens really just lasted for the length of the duration of that project and they served their purpose, and if they persist now, all the better. And that's great. I think, just being somebody who's in the Lehigh Valley community or just, around, I see more and more people talking about native plants. I see it more in the news than it ever has been. I think there's definitely an uptick of interest in that kind of gardening. Mm-hmm. I think that I'm all for, like, I have ornamentals in my yard too. Like I'm not a strict native plant person. I think most people aren't. I have a lot of flowers from my grandma and my friends and neighbors that aren't natives, but they aren't invasives either. Like that's a distinction. That's a line I'll draw. But I think our gardens should reflect who we are and what we love and the people that are in our lives. Like that's the way I look at it. It's a record, I can look out in my yard and when things are in bloom and I remember people who have given me things, whether it's native or non-native. And I think that's another beautiful thing about garden spaces. So anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but.
Yeah, but I like that. And yeah, I'm like you. I'm mostly natives. I've got a very heavy native plant bias, but I'm not a purist with it.
Yeah.
And yeah, my mother has lots of plants that she says, that's so-and-so and that's so-and-so. Because just like you said, they're plants that have been given to her by family members. And some of those family members are no longer with us. So that's kind of a remembrance for her.
Absolutely. More than photographs in my house. I think when I look out at my garden, it's those memories, it's the people. And, I really love that about it. My husband and I have moved houses, a time or two, and like, we can't leave without our plants. Like, we take the furniture, but we also take all of the plants. So it's kind of like this kind of crazy thing, but that's how meaningful it is for us. It's part of our life. It's part of who we are and how we, people we've known and our memories and things. I guess circling back to this idea of sense of place, it really goes deep for me.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was thinking too. It is that sense of place and that community, that comfort that plants can give us.
Yep, absolutely.
So are there things that you've learned through this whole process of doing this grant, writing the book, working with the community and even just gardening in your own garden and applying this hands-on small spaces to your own home.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you've learned that we haven't talked about, because we've talked about a bunch already, that we haven't talked about that you think could be applied elsewhere?
Well, I guess there's a couple things that come to mind. We moved into our current house, I don't know, maybe it's almost been 10 years now. Not quite, but almost. And when we got here, there was really nothing native in the yard. So we've been adding things slowly, and we have a lot of variety now, even on quarter acres, very small. But the amount of butterflies and wildlife that we've seen here now is amazing. It absolutely makes a difference to put in native plants. If you like, if you're interested in butterflies or, birds and things like that, or the local ecology or whatever, however you want to look at the world, it definitely makes a difference. When we were doing all of those gardens at those 20 locations or 40 locations in the Lehigh Valley, and we did interview people coming back, and that's what people said, we just love the monarchs. They just really, that was a big impression for them. People had their like wedding photographs taken in front of some of our native gardens because they just loved the look of it. And, in the schools that we went to, they were studying the pollinators and the butterflies that were coming there. And the other thing I would say is that, very surprising to me, when we were finished with the book and the project was ending, and I put the project on Facebook like one time or something, and it's like crazy how many people like we're a little Lehigh Gap Nature Center is a wonderful, powerful place and well known for many reasons, native plants being one of many. But it's not as though the Facebook page typically gets a lot of attention. But that book, when we posted it, it started being shared like crazy, which was surprising to us. And even now, and the project ended in 2018, so 3 years later, even now I'm talking to you right now about this, and I get random messages, even though I no longer work at Lehigh Gap Nature Center. I get random messages from people all over the United States who are like, I just love that book. It's what we've been waiting for. So I guess, and this is certainly not me bragging, but the point here is that I think that resource was needed. Like, I think that
yes,
people do really want to know how to use these plants in small spaces. And I think it's just filling a need that was out there, which I'm grateful for, because that's, that's what we hoped, at the beginning of the project. And I'm very proud that the book was the result of that work and all those minds, and that it's filling some kind of need that seems to be out there.
yes. And you should be proud, because it is a need that it is meeting, that people have had and still have, and will probably continue to have, is looking at this and how do we do this? Because there is an interest, but like you said, so much of the information and research and resources out there are geared more to those larger yards, those larger pollinator gardens and native plant settings. And we really need those resources that help to bring it back home and into these smaller spaces and into these urban and suburban yards and community spaces, and to give us those resources and normalize, as you said,
right,
having native plants there in addition or instead of some of these more common plants that have typically been used.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there is, as you're saying, I think there could be lots more work done kind of in the area of ideas for residents. And, I think that native plant enthusiasts, I think that we just need to be really open. And I think for a while there, perhaps, it's a native plant only world, or, like that sort of, I don't think that really works for a lot of people. I mean, I'm happy if you want to only do native plants. I'm not against that in any way, but we certainly wouldn't want to require anybody to, so that's my only point. I think an openness and a invitation to incorporate natives as it makes sense for anybody and their own way of gardening is what the need is out there.
Yes, I so agree with that. Finding that balance, and as you said at the very, very, very beginning, meeting people where they're at.
Yep, for sure.
So this has been great. If people have questions, can they contact you to ask more about?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Then I can put your contact information in the show notes.
Okay.
For people to find that. And like I said before, I'll have the link to the book. It's a free PDF download that anybody can download. And like I said, it's really good. I encourage everybody to look at it.
Cool.
And then I'll also put a link to Lehigh Gap Nature Center in there as
That would be
well.
great.
And people can go on there and look up all the great information about native plants that they have available.
Cool.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I greatly appreciate Kate taking time out of her busy schedule to talk with us about the program she worked on through the Lehigh Gap Nature Center, the book that she produced as part of that program, and her own experiences growing native plants. What she said about native plants helping to provide a sense of place really resonated with me. I think it can be very true, or at least I know it is in my case. I also think that what she said about meeting people where they are at and the sociology behind why we make the decisions we do about our yards are very important concepts. Unfortunately, those concepts are too often overlooked in conversations about gardening with native plants. Personally, I think the two-pronged approach they took with the program of creating native plant gardens in public spaces to normalize landscaping with native plants, and then the education and outreach component of the book, workshops, and gift cards was brilliant. Kate said that their goal was to create something that would outlive the project's funding, and it sounds like they were extremely successful at meeting that goal in multiple different ways. Not only are many of the native plant gardens that they established in the community still in place, but the book on using native plants in small yards continues to serve as a valuable resource for people well outside of the Lehigh Valley. If you've been wondering about how to incorporate native plants into your small space, or in a way that meets your HOA or other community guidelines, then I highly encourage you to go to the show notes and download Kate's free book, Native Plants for the Small Yard. And if you're trying to figure out how to do something similar in your community, again, go to the show notes and then click on the link for Lehigh Gap Nature Center's Landscaping for Communities and Wildlife program. Like Kate said, the funding for the program has run out, but it can still serve as a successful model for developing similar programs in other locations. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know that I offer live webinars almost every month. In April 2021, I will be hosting a series of classes on identifying and controlling invasive plant species on your property. If you're listening to this after April 2021, then I will likely have another webinar coming up soon. You can learn more about any of my upcoming webinars and how to register by visiting www.shannontremboli.com/virtual-classes, or just go to the web page for this podcast episode and click on the button located there. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.